The next item of business today is the members' business debate on motion number 6993 in the name of Graeme Pearson on enhancing enterprise for Scotland and China. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and I would be grateful if those members who wish to speak in the debate could please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on Graeme Pearson to open the debate. 7 minutes, please, Mr Pearson. Could I call for quiet in the public gallery, please?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and thank you to you and to the Parliament for giving me the opportunity to open this debate. I'm also grateful to the Minister for taking time out to play a part in our debate this afternoon. In setting a context, I would hope that at the conclusion of our discussions this afternoon, we've aided the Government in focusing in on some of the main issues that have been raised across Scotland, and particularly within the cross-party group on China, in developing and enhancing enterprise for Scotland and for China. Next month will mark the 64th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and it will also mark a remarkable transformation in a country on course to replace America as the world's largest economy. It is therefore vital that Scotland does all it can to forge close economic links with China to the benefits of both our countries. As convener of the cross-party group in China, there have been several needs regularly identified which should be a focus of work and attention by the Government. And to assist, I've bullet-pointed these needs. One is the establishment of direct flights between Scotland and China. Even one flight per month is deemed to improve our relationships with those who would engage with Scotland and want to know more about us. Second, and a difficult issue, improving visa and immigration processes for Chinese visitors, investors and educationalists. 3, increase and improve Chinese language opportunities for Scottish children. The use of Chinese language in the future will become an important relation-building exercise and will enable an understanding in both directions for both countries. The helping and encouraging of Scottish schools to twin with schools in China at both primary and secondary level. The supporting of small and medium-sized enterprises in establishing business links with China. We have a good track record at the large and global level, but those small and medium enterprises who find it hard to finance trips to China and the kinds of research that are required is a real challenge. The creation of a web page, Twitter and Facebook environment which would encourage cross-fertilisation of ideas amongst Scottish entrepreneurs and in connection with the Chinese audience would be an important way of placing the brand of Scotland at everybody's forefront. And finally, supporting the notion in the year ahead where we hope the homecoming will be a success for Scotland. Why would the Government not want to consider a homecoming for Chinese students who in previous decades have been here, successfully studied and still love our country, to encourage them to return to Scotland and bring with them a knowledge of where China is today? I would hope that it's not so much should we do it, but when we do these things. According to Visit Scotland, there's an ongoing exponential growth in the number of Chinese visitors to Scotland. The Scottish Parliament's External Relations Committee has agreed the establishment of a direct air link is vital. If we want to strengthen our economic links with China, then we must also ensure that we minimise the barriers of cooperation and trade between us. At the cross-party group, I regularly hear stories of Chinese businesses looking to invest in Scotland only to be deterred by the difficulties with visas and immigration. While I recognise these are indeed complicated issues which are reserved to the UK Parliament, the Scottish Government must examine all available avenues to minimise the barriers to trade and to encourage our colleagues at UK level to resolve some of these issues. The financial figures for the last few years illustrate how important trade with China is to Scotland. In the first half of 2012, trade between Scotland and China was worth almost £800 million, growing 14.4% from the previous year. These exports include traditional goods such as salmon and whisky, but they now extend to chemical-related products, machinery, transport equipment, which has increased by more than 40%. The fields of telecommunications, science, technology, ICT, renewable energy are all areas that China seek to expand. And even in the global economic crisis, banks in China have seen and expanded to an extent that their profits have increased by 109%. This further illustrates the importance of the relationship between China and Scotland. We must also bear in mind that with over 5,000 years of history, China has contributed a wealth of literature, art, philosophy and science to the world. China is on its way to becoming the world's largest economic power in our history. Its progress is built on a number of defined values that we should bear in mind. The need of the group and society are prioritised above the needs of the individual. Second, they seek to ensure harmony, pursuing unity and seeking common ground while simultaneously allowing differences. And thirdly, based on peaceful cooperation and existence, a mutual non-interference in each other's affairs. It's important we appreciate these differences. The challenge for China over the next 50 years is to develop harmony in its communities whilst responding to the ever-growing demands for consumer goods and enhanced standards of life. There are 150 million people in China living under the levels of poverty that one would deem to be acceptable. 40 years ago, 100 Chinese students came to the UK. Last year, British universities had 65,000, 7,000 of them in Scotland. We need to encourage Chinese students to come to Scotland and study while increasing and improving the opportunities for Scottish children to develop Chinese languages. The 5-year plan for China offers opportunities for Scotland to deliver. China seeks to enter a world population. We should engage in that ambition and ensure that we develop a relationship which is healthy and in the right direction. We must play our part in ensuring that China joins with Scotland in a modern world. And I would encourage the government, I would encourage the Minister to take note of the bullet points I've made and hopefully actively pursue them in the year ahead. Thanks, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. I call Gill Patterson to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Presiding Officer, can I thank Graeme Pearson for bringing this debate to the Chamber today, in particular the sentiments that he expressed in his delivery of his speech. Presiding Officer, I've been interested in China and the Chinese people since I was a child. My interest began, strange enough, when my granny gave my mother a pair of Chinese blue and white porcelain plates. And even as a young person, I was hooked on art. And the blue and white of China fascinated me. And the fascination continues almost to an illness today. You know, I really am keen on Chinese porcelain. However, I never thought that I would, as a Scottish businessman, find myself doing business with and in China. Some 18 years ago, I travelled to China for the first time, attending a massive commodities fair to establish links with Chinese companies in line with my own business. I was completely taken aback by the range of finished products at that time and the machinery to manufacture those products that were actually on show. So you had the products and you had the machines that would manufacture them. It was fascinating. However, I was pleasantly surprised when attempting to make contacts as how well informed many of the Chinese companies' representatives were about Scotland. However, it turned out to be no accident, as when communications broke down between China and nearly every Western country, the relationship between China and this tiny country, Scotland, was maintained. China never was close to Scotland. Scotland is a nation which was and is to this day trusted by China. The advantage this gives to Scotland over other countries is enormous. Scotland, with a population of 5.2 million, working with China, its population 1.34 people. What a partner for Scotland to work with. Having a population of 1.34 billion in a country like China, which has been in hyperdrive of development over the last 20 years, China is cramming into a mere decade the industrial effort that took the Western countries 200 years. A miracle in our lifetime, in fact, two miracles, with not only the fact that this massive country is physically and materially able to do this in the first place, but that the managing of it on a human scale is indeed a miracle. So with all this endeavour in China to better the country and its people, what can we do to both assist China and ourselves? China encourages partnership with external players. For our part, we can offer systems which are tried and trusted and can augment and give sustainability to the process in China, whether that be in the health industry, electronics or in education. On a less positive note, Presiding Officer, China has encouraged many of the students' population to do their learning abroad. Scotland is more than able to oblige. However, the obstacle of visa availability is having a detrimental impact both to Chinese students attending Scottish universities and to commerce in general. In fact, quite frankly, it's embarrassing that Chinese people from across sectors, including diplomats and politicians, are hindered by the UK government to enter Scotland for legitimate business. So fixing that problem would be of significant importance. I'd like to finish by endorsing the motion in Graeme Pearson's name, which in such a few lines highlight graphically why it's in our interest to work positively with China. Few people in Scotland know just how highly regarded our country is in China. They respect our views and our actions so importantly. Let's see how we can put this to good use for both our countries' future. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I respectfully ask members to keep to their 4 minutes? I call Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Stuart Stevens.
Can I congratulate Graeme Pearson on introducing this important debate and also recognising his interest in and knowledge about China, knowledge which is certainly shared by Gil Patterson, the previous speaker, but unfortunately not shared by me, which I regret and hope to do something about before too long. I do, however, recognise the central importance of China in the world economy. It is now the second most powerful economic nation in the world and will soon be the first. And the rise of China is really only comparable in terms of a revolutionary upheaval in global economic power. It's only comparable with the rise of the United States at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Now, of course, our global economy now is highly interconnected, and therefore it is actually in our interests to develop economic ties with China and also to take a great interest in the development of the Chinese economy, because it will have and has had a profound effect on economies in the West. And leading contemporary economists such as Martin Wolf in his book Fixing Global Finance and Will Hutton in his book The Writing on the Wall have emphasised this central importance of China for the world economy and for our economy. So clearly it's in our interest as well as their interest to develop economic ties, and in that regard I welcome the £800 million of trade we had with China in 2012, which I'm told is a 14% increase on the previous year. And I acknowledge the work of, for example, Scottish Development International, who again, I'm told, have increased from 77 to 208 companies in 5 years, the number of companies it's supporting to access Chinese markets. So clearly that work is important, but there's more to do, as Graeme Pearson has emphasised, on issues such as more direct air links and dealing with problems of visas, and the other issues that Graeme Pearson mentioned are clearly important, and building on the good progress that has been made in the last few years. But this is not, of course, just a matter of fostering economic connections. There's also the whole issue, which I think is recognised in the Scottish Government's working with China strategy, the whole issue of education and cultural links. So again, I welcome the fact we've got 7,000 Chinese students in Scottish universities and the fact that 18 Scottish higher education institutions have academic and research links with China. So that is clearly very important, as is encouraging more and more of our students in school to study Chinese languages. To me, it's kind of reminiscent of the 1960s when there was a fashion for learning Russian for understandable reasons, given the global significance of Russia then. Now I think China is the country that might be comparable to that, and the more people that can learn Chinese languages, the better. Last minute, other links are important as well. In my own constituency, we have the Botanic Gardens. Its most important international focus is China. That's been so for some time, is ongoing. And I would point out, in fact, that the Botanics not far from here has the largest collection of Chinese plants outside China in the whole world. There are also, of course, cultural links. I was pleased to see the Chinese production of Coriolanus during the Edinburgh Festival, an outstanding production it was as well, and also at the film festival to see a Chinese film called Three Sisters, which actually highlighted the poverty in much of rural China, because notwithstanding its overall high GDP, it does, of course, have a GDP per head that is 1/10 of ours, which highlights the issue of poverty. But the last thing I ought to indicate is, at the book festival, I heard a man called Ma Jian talk about his book, The Dark Road, and that leads us into some of these human rights issues, which it is right to acknowledge in this debate. The issue that he was writing about, and in fact rebelling about, was the one-child policy, but that, I think, does open up the wholly different attitude to individual freedom, which is, of course, underlies some of the human rights issues in China. And I actually do believe that we have to highlight abuses of human rights, but it shouldn't take away or detract from building positive relationships with China on economic and other issues.
Many thanks. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Jamie McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Graeme Pearson for the opportunity to have this very important debate. None of us will be within anything more than a couple of metres of something that has some Chinese technology in it. Very few of us will be within more than a couple of generations from people in our family who've been to and worked in and engaged directly with China. In my case, a rather distant cousin of mine, James Jeffrey, died in Shanghai at the age of 33 in 1870. So the connections between Scotland and China go a very long way back. We shouldn't get too complacent about them, because we played a not too creditable role in the exploitation of the Chinese population in the opium industry. But the world moves on, and I think we're in a substantially better place. My wife and I had the great privilege to go to China immediately after the end of the Cultural Revolution, arriving there on the 4th of November 1978. We'd had our name on the waiting list for a couple of years, and when we put our name on the waiting list, we couldn't even afford to go. So the delay was welcome. It enabled us to save up enough money. When we went to Beijing in November 1978, we found a country substantially different from that which you will find today. We saw not a single privately owned car while we were in China in the 1970s. Today in Beijing, the number of cars per 100 households is 60. That equates to something like 35 in London, the 40s in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It's not all good news, that, but it is a very strong indicator of the economic progress that is being made. And all the premium car makers have assembly plants out there. And indeed, the MG is now, for example, a Chinese-owned brand. We also had the immense privilege to go down to Kunming. It was accidental. We hadn't intended to go there, which is not well known, but most people will know about the road to Mandalay. Let me tell you, the other end of the road to Mandalay is Kunming in Yunnan province. And we were told, unverified, it could certainly be true that we were the first Westerners there since the revolution in the 1940s. But the history of Scotland's engagement with China was writ large in that visit in 1978. The English that people spoke, and it was widely spoken, was spoken with a Scottish accent, because the original tutors of English to the Chinese were Scots missionaries. There may not have been everything good about the engagement of the Scots missionaries, but there was that. Businesses like Jordan Matheson in Hong Kong had Scottish roots and continue to this day. In 1978, we were some 5 months away from a referendum on establishing a Scottish Assembly. That vote on the 1st of March 1979. Everywhere I went in China in 1978, I was asked questions about that referendum. They knew and were interested then, as now, in what was going on in Scotland. The motion before us touches a lot of very important buttons, and I'll just say a word or two in my concluding remarks, Presiding Officer, about Airlinks. As Transport Minister, I think I probably had 5 or 6 meetings with Chinese interests. I know the current Minister does the same. The barrier that we've actually got is a rather odd one. It's been the difficulties with a Boeing Dreamliner, because it's the actual only aircraft that fits the runway lengths we've got here to go to China with a single hop. It's actually a huge advantage for Scotland. We are closer in Edinburgh and Glasgow airports to Beijing in flying distance than London Heathrow. And the Chinese are interested in making Scotland the European hub connection airport. Let's hope we can do that. Congratulations again to Graeme Pearson.
Many thanks. I now call Jamie McGrigor to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I congratulate Graeme Pearson for securing today's debate, and I pay tribute also to his work as convener of the Parliament's cross-party group on China, which I'm happy to be a member. And the cross-party China group is a very good forum for raising some of the issues which we are discussing today. Now, like him and others, I'm very positive about increasing trade and educational links between Scotland and China, and I recognise the very significant potential economic benefits for Scotland in terms of increased exports, especially of food and drink products like whisky and Scotch salmon, and additional tourism income, of course, both of these being so important to my region of the Highlands and Islands. China's rapidly growing professional classes offer the same kind of opportunities that American markets and visitors have offered Scotland in past decades. And I commend the staff of businesses like Marine Harvest, whose processing factory at Fort William I visited earlier this year on behalf of the European Committee as part of the China Plan inquiry. Marine Harvest have greatly increased exports of their fresh farm salmon to China. Lorries travel directly from Fort William to Heathrow. Recently, the fish farm sector has been troubled by amoebic gill disease, which harmed their exports last year, but they are an example of good innovation in the export market to China. The European and External Affairs Committee inquiry into the Scottish Government's China Plan was widely welcomed, and I believe is a very useful report into this subject. The first recommendation was that the committee would welcome a response from the SDI on how it could make progress in supporting business-to-business partnerships between the Scottish and Chinese companies. And Hamza Yousaf, the Minister, who's with us now, said he agreed that there should be support in business-to-business partnerships and pointed out that the SDI had set up a new office in Shenzhen and increased their staff by 30%, which is very good. But the question about the SDI would not have been raised in the first place if things had been going 100%. So I hope that that's improved. The committee secured a positive media profile for the inquiry. The evaluation demonstrated that media coverage reached in excess of 750,000 people, which is a great deal. And the committee will soon consider the Scottish Government's response to the report. When taking evidence, it was important to hear from business people with direct experience in working in the Chinese market, including those in asset management, a sector Scotland has a very strong international reputation in. And I was struck in particular by evidence given by Angus Tulloch, a leading Scottish financier. Mr. Tulloch emphasised the requirement for businesses to find the right partner in China. That relationship building must be viewed as a long-term process, and that the value of speaking in the language of a country with which trading is desired cannot be understated. And I think all of us in this chamber would agree on this latter point, and I would be supportive of additional efforts to increase the learning of Mandarin Chinese in Scottish schools, colleges and the universities. Increasing the availability of teaching of Mandarin is obviously key to this being realised. The European Committee inquiry into the teaching of modern languages in Scotland, which has been taking place lately with my committee, should help to highlight and improve Scots children's learning of Mandarin. Now, many businesses highlighted the major difficulty of obtaining visas for Chinese business people, and this must be looked into by the relevant departments in order to stop good ideas being wasted through red tape and technicalities. And on the issue of a direct flight to China, again, we're positive about this concept and recognise that business leaders have argued that a direct air link is of crucial importance to the Chinese view of Scotland, and that it could encourage more Chinese firms to recognise the possibilities of using Scotland as a European headquarters. It could also provide a real boost in terms of tourism, and I would also highlight that business leaders have also suggested that such a link would also have to be low cost, and low cost enough to rival the available routes for business travel to Europe. And so, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, today's debate is a very important one. And I'm sure that this Parliament will debate our links with China with increasing frequency as we go forward. I look forward to the Minister's response to today's debate and to the European and External Affairs Committee's further consideration of the Scottish Government's China plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Roderick Campbell, to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this members' debate and congratulate Graeme Pearson on securing the debate. As we know, China is a growing economy with a growth of around 9% per annum, according to the OECD, and it continues to grow. Two facts about the Chinese economy stand out in particular. Chinese economic growth contributed to a third of global growth in 2011, and China is now the world's second largest goods importer, behind only the United States. What we have seen in recent years is a paradigm shift in international trade. It's no wonder that there are now several graphics circulating on the internet originating from a variety of high-profile research institutions such as the LSE, which purport to show the economic centre of gravity. For those of us who are unfamiliar with geopolitical jargon, and I might count myself as one of that group, the economic centre of gravity is generally defined as being the precise spot on the globe where we can identify the average economic activity of the globe. It is worked out based on GDP of every country on the planet, and whilst it might not necessarily mean much in terms of policy, the dot is shifting very quickly. Travelling from the mid-Atlantic in the 1980s, perhaps unsurprisingly, by 2050, it's predicted that it will have travelled east to lie somewhere between China and India. Why mention this? Well, because of the importance of China to Scotland and indeed to the world as a whole, and of the importance of the China plan to Scotland over the next 30 years. China will become an ever-important focal point for Scottish business. If we're to meet the targets within the China plan for increasing trade opportunities, both in terms of increasing the value of exports to China and in encouraging investment, we have to understand the importance of China's formidable economic trajectory. Presiding Officer, trade with China is unique. Successful interaction with China for business and government depends heavily on genuine mutual engagement. As Stephen Parry, chairman of the 48 Group Club of UK businesses, has said, we should start thinking of China as a global partner and not just an economy. But I'd like to stress my view that successful economic partnerships depend not just on trade deals, but also, and perhaps most importantly of all, on attitudes and perceptions. How do Scots see China? How do Scots do business at an international level? What are our skills and what do we offer as a people? How do we interact with others and how adaptable are we? The British Council in Scotland has said we need a new generation of Scots who are globalised citizens, people ready to interact on the world stage with confidence. And despite our best intentions, we would all admit that one skill lacking in so many Scots, regardless of their level of qualification, is the ability to interact in foreign languages. The European and External Relations Committee has, of course, been conducting an inquiry into foreign language learning in primary schools. We have at least some understanding of what the barriers are to an increased uptake of languages, like Mandarin. We simply do not have a sufficiency of qualified teachers, for example. However, arguably the biggest long-term barrier to language learning in Scotland is attitudinal. Given the choice, many young Scots choose other subjects over foreign languages. But with Mandarin, there is some cause for optimism. Figures show that young Scots are bucking the trend by opting for Mandarin where it's available, in greater numbers than for any other language, and their uptake is the highest in the UK. Around 70 Scottish schools are now teaching Mandarin, including a primary school in Lucas in my constituency, as well as a secondary school in St Andrews. And 300 Scottish students took exams in Mandarin last year, compared with 100 in 2011. But finally, we also need to understand there is a cultural and historical aspect to this. As Stuart Stevens already mentioned the Opium Wars, and my colleague Jamie McGregor has also mentioned the evidence of Angus Tulloch to the European Committee. He said to the committee, people should not go into China without understanding the damage we did during the Opium Wars. And on that note, I shall conclude, Presiding Officer, and I look forward to hearing the Minister's comments on his recent trip to China in due course. Thank you.
Many thanks. Our final open debate speaker is Margaret McDougall.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'd also like to congratulate Graeme Pearson on securing this important debate on enhancing enterprise for Scotland and China. Unfortunately, I haven't been to China, but it is on my list of places to go. As the motion states, China is currently the second largest economy in the world. It is therefore vital that Scotland strives to foster relationships with China. This members' debate is an excellent opportunity to highlight the economic importance of such a relationship. Graeme Pearson also set up the cross-party group to promote relations between Scotland and China, and it works with organisations and authorities to increase cultural, educational and economic exchange between the two countries. The CPG also highlights the barriers that exist in developing these links. To address the 4 major barriers identified by the CPG, we need, as has already been mentioned many times today, direct flights from Scotland to China, improved trade, educational links and language opportunities, as well as improved visa and immigration procedures. I welcome that the Scottish Government recognise the importance of direct flights in an answer to a parliamentary question by Mr Pearson earlier this session. Establishing such a link will be invaluable, not only for business and establishing successful trade links, but to tourism. It should be a key priority, which would be of economic benefit both for China and for Scotland. Perhaps the Minister can update us today on what progress has been made on this today. We also need to make sure it's easier for businesses to be established here. Again, through the CPG, one issue that was identified as a hindrance to the setting up of business ventures was the cost and processing time for visas. This also affects the visitor numbers to Scotland. I know that these matters are reserved, but I wonder what discussions the Scottish Government has had with its UK counterparts to tackle these barriers, to ensure Chinese businesses can invest in Scotland and vice versa. In the meantime, Scottish Development International needs to continue working closely to build relationships with Chinese investment companies and entrepreneurs, outlining why Scotland is an attractive investment opportunity and why such relationships can be beneficial to both countries. To further improve trade links, we need a multifaceted approach focusing on improving the teaching of Mandarin and Cantonese and our understanding of Chinese culture through education, for example, school twinning and cultural exchange. Because it is deeply important that we do everything we can to foster not only economic links between Scotland and China, but cultural links too. While I welcome the Scottish Government's 5-year strategy for engagement between Scotland and the People's Republic of China, I hope we can see this strategy extended to encompass longer-term outcomes and goals. In closing, once again, I would like to thank Graeme Pearson for bringing this motion to the Chamber today, and I thank the CPG for their work in bringing our two nations closer together, because as we help to open up China, we can play an important role in reducing China's human rights issues. Thank you.
Many thanks. I can now invite the Minister, Humza Yousaf, to respond to the debate. Minister, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too would like to start by giving my thanks to Graeme Pearson for tabling this motion, for securing today's debate, which has highlighted the strength of Sino-Scottish links. I want to put on record the great work that the CPG does under his and Gil Patterson and the rest of the members' stewardship. I think it's a great asset and resource for government, along with other partners such as the External Relations Committee who advise us. The report, very thoughtful, very insightful, and one, of course, which we will get a full response in full time. And also partners like the Consul General Lee, the Chinese Consul General, who really strains every sinew possible to ensure that we have closer collaboration between Scotland and China, and all these other partners that I don't have time to mention. I thank them too. The astounding story of today's debate will be that we had an entire 45 minutes debate about China and Scotland, and nobody once mentioned pandas. I think that's incredible, actually. But nonetheless, I mention it in jest, but with a serious point that that itself shows a closening in relations between our two nations. The Scottish Government's China strategy is an important statement of commitment to the Chinese Government about the importance that we have as a nation to this relationship. The refreshed China strategy contains 4 guiding principles which will continue to shape our engagement with China. And I think they're important, all of them in their own right, but I'll perhaps reference 1 or 2 of them just for clarification. They are securing sustainable economic growth, respect for human rights and the rule of law, understanding of culture, something mentioned by Graeme Pearson, increasing Scotland's influence in the international stage. And I agree entirely with Malcolm Chisholm's sentiment, and it was later referred to by Margaret McDougall in her closing, that the respect for human rights and the rule of law is imperative, and that's why it's a part of our strategy. But just as Malcolm Chisholm quite rightly said, that shouldn't preclude us from continuing to do what is right in regards to Scotland's economic interest, and there's no contradiction between doing both. The importance of China as a growing economic superpower has been reaffirmed in this debate. And it is absolutely an opportunity to make sure that we try to contribute towards economic growth for Scotland through that relationship. Make no doubt about it. It is competitive. China is incredibly competitive. Having been there, I was certainly not the only delegate from other parts of the world, but Scotland has some incredibly unique offerings, world-class companies, world-class talents, research excellence, world-class universities, and indeed, in fact, luxury goods as well, salmon and whisky being perhaps top of that list. The demand is there. Of course I will.
Jamie McGregor.
I'm encouraged by what the Minister is saying, but in recommendation 2 of the European Committee's report on the China plan, it pointed out that there is a lack of awareness of the existence of the plan itself and the support available from the Scottish Government among some of the stakeholders. Would you like to comment on that?
Minister.
Sure, and as I said, we will reflect on the plan. I think there's always more that we can do, of course, to make sure that businesses, small businesses, medium-sized businesses in particular, know about the outcomes that we have, and also actually the expert services that SDI provide, be that market research, incubation hubs, and so on and so forth. So I mean, that point is well made in the report, and certainly one that we will look to reflect upon. The demand is there from Scottish businesses, though. I mean, they rank China as their #1 future market. There has been an over 80% increase in the last 5 years in terms of exports there. Jamie McGregor and Graeme Pearson also made the point about small and medium-sized enterprise. I think it was a point that was well made. And SDI are leading another mission to China of Scottish businesses. 80% of those businesses are what we would classify as small and medium-sized enterprises. So we take that point on board, but also reflect absolutely that there's more that we can do. On my recent visit to China, actually, one of the small, I don't even think you can call it medium-sized, actually one of the small enterprises we helped sign a contract, and we witnessed the signing of the contract. It was TEFL Scotland, a husband and wife team in Dingwall who literally started their business from a garden shed, employing 10 people, doubling their workforce and securing a contract with one of China's biggest teaching online resources is a fantastic example of that. But I agreed absolutely that more can be done. We heard today from a variety of speakers. Gil Patterson made the point, I thought, very well about higher education and language and the importance of language, but higher education and indeed university education, how we attract that phenomenal amount of Chinese students, and one offer of excellence that Scotland has in terms of its teaching and its research. I believe that by collaboration, both sides can learn from one another, gain a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities that face the world, actually. Scotland has been successful, as many speakers have said, in attracting Chinese students and those from Hong Kong. It's not just about the students that come to study here. There's, of course, the economic benefit they bring when their families come, when they spend here as well, but also for what they bring culturally and academically as well. I'll talk more about the visa regime in just a second, but I agree that there is a difficulty there, if nothing else, of at least perception of Scotland's openness and the UK's openness. And we will continue to encourage the UK government, have discussions with the UK government where and when appropriate. That message should be that Scotland and the UK is open to the best talent, academic talent, business talent the world has to offer, and that China has to offer. And my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs, has had that discussion many a time, and had that discussion on behalf of University of Scotland, the Institute of Directors, Federation of Small Businesses and others, and will continue to do that, as I say, when and where appropriate. Language was mentioned, and that point is extraordinarily important. Changing the cultural mindset, as Roderick Campbell said, can be a certainly difficult task, but the pragmatic and practical things that we can do and have done include, for example, development of 13 Confucius classrooms, hubs in Scotland, each linked with a school in Tianjin, covering 17 local authorities here in the country. Learning Chinese language is one part of learning about China, its history and its growth in the modern world, but it's an extraordinarily important part, and we'll continue to do what we can to increase the uptake of language. As I said, with Airlinks was mentioned, I think, by almost every speaker, and the Scottish Government, well before I became a member of the Government, has been pursuing this vigorously through ministers in tourism, external affairs, and many other departments as well. My ministerial colleague, Fergus Ewing, has sought the establishment of a stakeholder group in terms of bringing businesses together to see, to discuss collaboration between Scotland and China. And one of the main remarks made from business people is the need for that direct link. So we are stressing and straining every sinew that we can. I indeed was lucky to meet with the Chinese Civil Aviation Authority, and we agreed a number of steps to take forward the promotion and hopefully getting to that point where we can get a direct link between Scotland and China. I endeavour, as soon as there's any update on how progress is being made, that the cross-party group is kept updated, as is the External Affairs Committee as well. So we do have steps that we're taking, and I'll make sure that we update them. Just to conclude, Presiding Officer, under the China strategy, we have committed to establishing a stakeholder implementation and delivery forum to help set up and to share best practice and practical expertise to promote collaborative working. I'm pleased the first meeting of this forum will be held at the end of this month, and again we'll look forward to hearing the outcomes of these discussions. I'm pleased to announce at the same time an online information hub on Sino-Scottish links will be launched. I know this topic has been of particular interest to Graeme Pearson, the cross-party group, and again I'm delighted that will be launched very, very soon. So I thank members for their contribution today, and I endeavour, for the points that are mentioned in the motion about language, air links, universities, visas and tourism, I endeavour that if there's progress made in these, that the cross-party group, members of Parliament and indeed committees are kept best up to date. But thank you for all the contributions and the opportunity for this debate today.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes Graeme Pearson's debate on enhancing enterprise for Scotland and China, and I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30 p.m.